Belgravia Manor, London, September 2024. Oliver Harrington, 8 years old, son of billionaire James Harrington, hasn't spoken a single word since his mother died in an accident 2 years ago. The best psychologists in Europe couldn't get him to speak. Today, James comes home from work and discovers an incredible scene. His son is laughing and playing on the living room floor with Emma Clarke, 26, the new housekeeper he hired just a week ago. But when James approaches, he hears something he hadn't heard in 2 years. Oliver's voice saying, "Hello, Dad," while smiling at the poorest woman in the house. What happens in the next few minutes will forever change the fate of a broken family and prove that sometimes miracles come from the most unexpected people. Belgravia Manor stood in the heart of London like a palace of glass and marble, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens that seemed straight out of an architecture magazine. James Harrington, 45, had this residence custom-built for his family. 4 floors of pure luxury overlooking Hyde Park, furnished with artworks worth millions of pounds and cutting-edge technology. James was the owner of Harrington Technologies, a tech empire that produced components for smartphones and computers worldwide. His wealth exceeded £2 billion, built through years of obsessive work and determination that had made him one of the most feared and respected men in the business world. But all the money in the world couldn't protect his family from the tragedy that struck them 2 years ago. His wife Charlotte, a gentle and radiant woman, died in a car accident whilst collecting Oliver from school. A lorry had veered into the opposite lane and killed her instantly, leaving James a widower and Oliver motherless at just 6 years old. Since that cursed day, Oliver hadn't spoken a single word. The child, who was once lively and chatty, had locked himself in total silence that no one could break. James had taken his son to the best psychologists in Europe, paid astronomical sums for innovative therapies, even brought specialists in childhood trauma from America, but nothing had worked. The doctors explained that Oliver suffered from selective mutism caused by the trauma of loss. The child was physically capable of speaking, but the pain had created a psychological barrier, preventing him from communicating verbally. He could nod, shake his head, draw, write simple words, but his voice remained imprisoned by grief. James felt powerless facing his son's silence. Every evening, he came home hoping to hear Oliver's voice, even a whisper, but the manor remained wrapped in a silence that had become deafening. The child attended an exclusive private school where teachers had been briefed about his condition, but there, too, he communicated only through gestures and small written notes. To care for Oliver, James had hired a series of qualified governesses and assistants, all women with degrees in psychology or pedagogy, recommended by the best agencies. But none had managed to create a special bond with the child. Oliver tolerated them, obeyed their instructions, but remained emotionally distant. The previous week, James had to dismiss yet another governess, a cold and professional woman who treated Oliver more like a patient than a child. He was desperate and asked his secretary to find someone, anyone, as long as they were available immediately. That's how Emma Clarke arrived, a 26-year-old from a working-class family in Manchester. Emma didn't have prestigious diplomas or masters in child psychology. She'd studied at night whilst working during the day to make ends meet, and only had a B.Tech in business studies. But she possessed something all the previous governesses lacked: a big heart and a natural way with children that came from instinct, not books. Emma had arrived in London with a cardboard suitcase and £50 in her pocket, after losing her job at a small Manchester firm that closed due to the recession. She'd responded to the Harrington family's advert more out of desperation than ambition, knowing she didn't have the required qualifications, but hoping her experience as the eldest sister of 4 younger brothers might count for something. When James interviewed her, he immediately noticed Emma was different from other candidates. She didn't have the professorial air of psychologists or the rigidity of qualified governesses. She was simple, authentic, and when she spoke about children, her eyes lit up with genuine warmth. He decided to hire her more on instinct than logic. Emma's first day in the house was quiet. Oliver observed her from afar with the wariness he showed all newcomers, but without particular hostility. Emma didn't do anything special. She prepared breakfast, tidied the house, helped Oliver with his homework, whilst maintaining a respectful but warm attitude. But from the second day, James noticed something strange. Oliver, who usually stayed locked in his room or in the lounge drawing alone, had started following Emma around the house. He didn't speak to her, obviously, but he watched her, whilst she cooked, cleaned, tidied, and most importantly, he'd started smiling when she wasn't looking. Emma had her own way of interacting with Oliver. She didn't treat him like a traumatized child who needed special care, but like a normal child who'd simply chosen not to speak for a while. She'd tell him what she was doing whilst cleaning, sing Manchester folk songs whilst cooking, include him in her domestic activities, as if he were her little assistant. That September evening, James was returning from a particularly stressful day at the office. An important negotiation had failed, and he'd had to make several redundancies, decisions that had emotionally exhausted him. All he wanted was to hold his son and try to communicate through the gestures and smiles that had become their language. He opened the front door and was struck by a sound he hadn't heard in months. Laughter. Real, spontaneous, joyful laughter. He stopped in the entrance hall, confused, trying to understand where it was coming from. In the grand living room, on Persian rugs that cost more than a car, Emma and Oliver were sitting on the floor playing. She'd taken off her shoes and was building a cushion fort with him, laughing and joking as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Oliver was laughing heartily whilst trying to balance a cushion on top of their precarious construction. James stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding. He hadn't seen his son this happy in 2 years. But what happened next left him completely breathless. Oliver saw his father at the door and, instead of his usual timid wave, jumped up and ran towards him, shouting the phrase that would change everything. "Dad, look what Emma and I built!" James felt his legs buckle. His son had spoken. He'd said a complete sentence in the most beautiful voice in the world. Emma watched them smiling, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. But James saw in her eyes that she too understood she'd just witnessed a miracle. James remained paralyzed for what seemed an eternity, staring at his son, who looked at him with eyes bright with excitement. Oliver's words still resonated in the air like a forgotten melody that had suddenly returned to play. For 2 years, he'd dreamed of this moment, and now that it had happened, he couldn't believe it was real. Oliver continued chattering, telling his father everything he'd done with Emma during the day. He'd helped her make pasta, learned a Manchester nursery rhyme, drawn a picture he wanted to give to Dad. It was as if 2 years of pent-up words were finally coming out all at once in a joyful stream of communication. James spent that evening listening to his son's voice, each word a caress to his heart. Oliver told stories, laughed, asked questions, had become again the lively child he was before the tragedy. And all thanks to Emma, a girl who'd approached his son without prejudice, only with authentic love. When bedtime came, Oliver asked if Emma could read him a story. James followed them to the bedroom, hiding behind the door to listen. Emma told the story with character voices, creating an atmosphere of warmth that James hadn't felt in the house for too long. The next day, James decided to stay home to better observe the interaction between Emma and Oliver. What he saw amazed him even more. Emma had a natural way of involving the child in every activity. She cooked and had him help, cleaned, and he became her special assistant. But above all, Emma spoke to Oliver about his mother without fear. Other governesses avoided the subject, but Emma instead allowed him to remember Charlotte, to keep the memory alive without making it a painful taboo. James was moved to see his son smile whilst talking about Charlotte. In the following days, James began spending more time at home. The girl had transformed the cold, silent manor into a house full of life. She sang whilst working, involved Oliver in everything she did, created a family atmosphere that had been missing for too long. But James began to notice something else. Emma wasn't just good with children, she was an extraordinary person. Despite her young age and modest background, she had a wisdom that struck him. From small things she mentioned, James understood she'd had a difficult life. One evening, whilst Oliver slept, James stopped to chat with Emma in the kitchen. She told him that when her father left home, she'd become the second mother to her brothers. She'd learned that children need love more than rules, that life is too short not to say important things. James was struck by the profound simplicity of these words. He'd spent 2 years searching for complicated treatments for his son, when all Oliver needed was to feel loved and accepted for who he was. But talking with Emma, James realized he was feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just gratitude for what she'd done for Oliver. It was attraction, admiration, the desire to know her better as a woman. In the weeks that followed, Belgravia Manor transformed completely. Oliver had started speaking again, with a naturalness that amazed James every day. The child recounted everything he did at school, asked 1,000 questions, sang the songs Emma taught him. But whilst James was overjoyed at his son's progress, he found himself struggling with feelings he hadn't experienced since Charlotte's death. Emma wasn't just the perfect governess. She was a fascinating woman who attracted him in a way he tried to ignore. James began finding excuses to stay home more often. He postponed meetings.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Delegated trips to his colleagues, invented problems to solve in his home office. He wanted to stay near Emma and Oliver, to savor this family atmosphere he'd believed lost forever. Emma, for her part, had noticed the change in James's behavior. The cold and distant businessman of the early days had become a present and attentive father. She watched him play with Oliver, take interest in his drawings, laugh at his jokes. One evening, whilst they prepared dinner together, James had the courage to confess that he'd thrown himself into work after Charlotte's death to avoid thinking about the pain, but now understood he'd been wrong. Emma replied that he'd done what he thought right at the time, and what mattered was that he was now present for Oliver. James looked into her eyes and saw not just the woman who'd saved his son, but an extraordinary person he was falling in love with. The problem was that Emma worked for him, and any approach could be interpreted as an abuse of power. One morning, whilst Emma was giving Oliver breakfast in the garden, James received a phone call that upset him. It was Michael Brooks, a tabloid journalist who'd always tried to pry into his private life. The man had compromising photos and threatened to publish them, insinuating a relationship between James and the housekeeper. James immediately understood the gravity of the situation. If these photos ended up in the papers, Emma's reputation would be destroyed. She'd be labeled a gold digger, regardless of the truth. That evening, James made the most difficult decision of his life. He called Emma to his office and told her he had to let her go. He invented a professional excuse, said he needed someone with more specific qualifications for Oliver. Emma listened in silence, understanding there was something James wasn't telling her, but accepted the decision with dignity. When she told Oliver she was leaving, the child burst into desperate tears, and for the first time in weeks, stopped speaking. The day of Emma's departure was heartbreaking. Oliver had retreated into silence again, and refused any form of communication. Emma went up to his room and found him sitting on the bed, with eyes swollen from tears. She told him that sometimes in life things happen that we can't control, but he must never forget to use his beautiful voice. She made him promise to keep talking, smiling, being the wonderful child he was. James watched this scene hidden behind the door, tears streaming down his face. He realized that Emma truly loved Oliver. and that he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. After Emma left, Belgravia Manor became the silent, cold house it was before. Oliver had completely stopped speaking and spent his days locked in his room. James hired a new qualified governess, but the child completely ignored her. A week later, the headmistress of Oliver's school called James, worried because the child had returned to complete mutism. James understood he could no longer lie to himself. His son's happiness was more important than any gossip. That evening, he decided to bring Emma back home. But when he tried to contact her, he discovered she'd disappeared from London. She'd left the flat, and the number was no longer active. James hired the best private detective in London to find her. The detective managed to reconstruct Emma's path. She'd returned to Manchester for a few days, then settled in a small village in the Lake District where she'd found work in a children's home for orphans. James didn't hesitate for a second. He left for the Lake District with Oliver, determined to win back the woman they'd both lost. The village was called Grasmere and sat on a hillside surrounded by lakes and fells. The children's home where Emma worked was a simple but welcoming structure, run by a charity that cared for abandoned or troubled children. When James and Oliver arrived, Emma was in the garden playing with a group of children. She wore a simple dress and had her hair tied in a ponytail, but to James, she was more beautiful than any woman he'd ever known. Emma saw them arrive and stood still, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected to ever see them again, and their presence filled her with joy and fear at the same time. Oliver ran to her without saying a word, but when he hugged her, he whispered that he'd looked for her everywhere and asked why she'd left. The child's voice, after days of silence, made Emma cry with emotion. James approached cautiously, not knowing how Emma would react to his presence. He told her he'd come to remedy the terrible mistake he'd made. They sat under an oak tree whilst Oliver played with the other children, smiling for the first time in weeks. James told Emma everything: the journalist's call, the fear of scandal, the decision to send her away to protect her. He also confessed his feelings, told her he'd fallen in love with her and could no longer imagine his life without her. James asked her to marry him, to become a real family. He proposed leaving London, buying a house in this wonderful village, raising Oliver as a normal child, whilst she continued doing what she loved, caring for children in need. Emma looked at him incredulously, asking if he'd really leave everything. James replied that he'd already lost everything that truly mattered once and didn't want to make the same mistake twice. At that moment, Oliver ran to them, asking if they could stay there and become a real family. Emma looked at this child she'd learned to love like a son, and the man who'd made her feel like a complete woman for the first time in her life. She said yes, and the three of them embraced under the oak tree, finally certain that no one would ever leave again. James kept his promise. He bought a house in the historic center of Grasmere, opened a small office from which he ran his company, discovering that working less and living more made him a better entrepreneur. 2 years after that day under the oak tree, the Harrington Clarke family was living a happiness none of them had ever dared dream of. James and Emma had married in a simple ceremony in the village church, with Oliver as best man and all the children from the home as bridesmaids and page boys. Oliver, now 10 years old, had become the happiest and liveliest child in the village. He attended the local school, where he was loved by everyone for his cheerful character and generosity. He had a group of real friends, played football for the village team, and helped Emma at the children's home every afternoon. The child who 2 years earlier couldn't speak a word now never stopped talking. He told fantastic stories, made everyone laugh with his jokes, had inherited Emma's love for younger children and James's determination to achieve his goals. James had discovered that life in the countryside gave him a serenity he'd never known. He'd sold the London Manor and drastically reduced his professional commitments, delegating daily management of the company to his most trusted colleagues. He only dealt with the most important strategic decisions, working from his small office in historic Grasmere. But the real transformation had happened in Emma. The shy, insecure girl from 2 years ago had become a confident woman who ran the children's home with competence and love. She'd managed to secure funding to expand the facility, created innovative programs for young people's social integration, and had become a reference point for the entire village. One spring evening, whilst they sat in their house's garden watching Oliver play with the dog they'd adopted, Emma told James news that filled them with joy. She was pregnant. James hugged her tightly, overwhelmed with emotion. When they told Oliver, the child exploded with joy, immediately starting to make plans for the future little sibling and proclaiming himself the best big brother in the world. 9 months later, Sophie was born, a beautiful little girl with Emma's brown hair and James's blue eyes. Oliver adored her from the first moment, caring for her with a tenderness that moved everyone. The house filled again with laughter, newborn cries, and that sweet chaos only children can create. James, who'd feared he wasn't a good father to Oliver, proved extraordinary with Sophie too, discovering that paternal love doesn't diminish when divided, but multiplies. One day, journalist Michael Brooks arrived at their home, the one who years earlier had threatened to create a scandal. The man wanted to write an article about the transformation of the billionaire-turned-country gentleman. But when he saw James coming home on a bicycle with Oliver sitting behind him laughing, when he saw Emma waiting at the door with Sophie in her arms, he understood there was no scandal to tell. There was only a happy family who'd chosen love over success. In the evening, after putting the children to bed, James and Emma sat on their house's terrace looking at the stars. Emma asked if he sometimes regretted leaving London, and James replied that he'd found real life here, that wealth is measured in smiles, hugs, words of love whispered in the evening. At that moment, they heard Oliver's voice from his bedroom, asking if he could come and look at the stars with them. James and Emma smiled and called him over. Oliver ran onto the terrace in his pajamas and sat between his parents, looking at the starry sky. He asked if Mummy Charlotte could see them from up there, and James told him she could surely see them, and was happy to see them so happy. Oliver said he'd say goodnight to her every evening then, tell her he had a beautiful family and wasn't sad anymore. James and Emma looked at each other with eyes bright with emotion. The child who couldn't speak had become a wise boy who knew how to honor the memory of his biological mother without forgetting the love of his mother by heart. That night, looking at the stars with his 2 children and his wife, James understood he'd found true wealth. It wasn't in money, power, success. It was in that voice he'd believed lost forever. In that woman who'd transformed a house into a home. In this family born from love and grown in simplicity. Oliver's silence had been broken not by expensive therapies, but by the love of a woman who'd believed in him when no one else could. And that love had created a miracle that changed 3 lives forever, proving that sometimes the most powerful remedy is simply to feel loved for who you are. If this story of love and rebirth moved you, hit like and subscribe for more incredible stories of families who found happiness in unexpected ways. Tell me in the comments, do you believe love can truly work miracles? Have you experienced a moment that changed your life forever? And don't miss the next video where you'll discover another extraordinary story that will make you believe in the power of authentic love that heals all wounds.